Hello, welcome to the channel Wise Stories. Enjoy watching.
At night, Crispo was briskly walking through the streets of the city where he had spent his childhood and youth. His heart pounded in his chest like a caged bird, his temples throbbed, and he saw colorful blotches in his eyes. His breath was erratic, but he hardly noticed it. He just wanted to get as far away from the restaurant as possible, far from such a surprise. After all, this trip was supposed to be pleasant and easy. His childhood friend, Eusebio, had invited Crispo to his wedding. It surprised him since he had long considered his friend a confirmed bachelor, and now he had a wedding. Crispo was curious to meet the woman who had captured his free-spirited friend and to reconnect with his youth and hometown. Of course, Crispo couldn't pass up such an opportunity, as it was a bright spot in his dull days. Crispo even took an unscheduled week off from work for this occasion. His old friends thought he was quite successful. He lived and worked in the capital and left a provincial town. Little did they know that Crispo had been toiling for years in an ordinary position at a less-than-thriving company and spent a minimum of 4 hours commuting to and from work each day. His home was far from the office, almost on the outskirts of the city, in a far-from-prestigious neighborhood. His cramped two-bedroom apartment had long been in need of renovation, but Crispo didn't want to start that ordeal. To him, it was sufficient. He lived alone, and the only thing he did at home was sleep. What use was all that space to a bachelor like him, especially given the cost? Crispo couldn't afford to spend a substantial sum on renovations. His salary wasn't exactly meager, but it didn't allow for luxuries either. His personal life also seemed to be lacking. There were occasional flings, of course, but nothing serious. Most of the women who came into Crispo's life were looking for a place to stay, hoping to save on rent while they got settled in the city. Crispo could see through their intentions easily. It was evident in their looks, words, and actions. It was unpleasant, of course, but perhaps by the age of 35, it was the right time to realize that pure and bright love didn't exist. In relationships, everyone pursued their own goals and interests. It seemed in his youth that someday he would meet the perfect woman, beautiful, loving, intelligent, sincere, and in love with household chores like his mother and grandmother. On the other hand, she would be independent, able to occupy herself when her husband hung out with friends, and she would adore her spouse and be his reliable support. With her, Crispo would build a family, and they would live happily ever after. Reflecting on those dreams, Crispo marveled at how naive and foolish he had been. Such women didn't exist, such relationships didn't exist, and nothing in life could be entirely satisfying. This realization came gradually, and disappointments awaited at every turn: work, personal life, daily life. Crispo had so many plans and hopes for living in the capital in his youth. He thought that once he escaped his hometown and settled in the capital, life would burst into vibrant colors. He would have beautiful women, abundant opportunities, lucrative job offers, nightclubs, fun parties, and new friends. In reality, it had turned out differently: a small, two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, cramped, in an old building, and far from civilization. But even with these modest accommodations, Crispo had not yet paid off his debts. His family had helped with the initial down payment, and it was a substantial sum. With that amount, Crispo could have bought a spacious apartment in his hometown and made luxurious renovations. But in the capital, it was just a small part of the cost of a decrepit top-floor apartment in a 5-story building. Crispo didn't despair, though. At the time, he was full of plans and hope, feeling happy about finally breaking free. He left his mother, grandmother, grandfather, friends, and Helia behind in his hometown. His relationship with Helia had been taking a very serious turn, and it had scared Crispo. She was a good, attractive, modest, and caring girl, but the intensity of her feelings overwhelmed him. Moreover, how many Helias like her would he encounter in the future? It wasn't practical to bring her along to the capital. Crispo quickly found a job. There were indeed many offers, but they weren't as enticing as he had imagined back home. Nevertheless, Crispo wasn't disheartened. He needed money to live and pay off the mortgage. Plus, he needed to gain some experience. He thought everything was ahead of him, but more than 10 years passed, and nothing had changed significantly. Crispo was still working in low-paying positions. To climb the career ladder, you needed connections, extraordinary intelligence, an incredible work ethic, a love for your job, and passion for your work. Crispo had none of that. He went through his office hours as a duty and received his salary at the end of the month, most of which he spent on obligatory payments, rent, loans, and the mortgage. With the rest, he had to live until the next salary. Crispo had always been attracted to beautiful women who were bright like stars, with long, slender legs, radiant, huge eyes, self-assured, witty, and ambitious. There were certainly many such women in the capital city, but Crispo was not at all drawn to them. What could a dull office worker living from paycheck to paycheck offer such women? Back in his hometown, Crispo had been a sought-after bachelor, and for good reason. He was the grandson of the chief physician at the local hospital and a student at a prestigious university. In those days, he felt like the best of the best, with many friends and girls admiring him. But Crispo always dreamed of more. He yearned for life in the capital city and believed he deserved a better, more vibrant existence than the one he had in his hometown. Crispo often spoke disdainfully of provincial life, referring to his hometown as a village and a swamp, and insisted that he would never stay there. He didn't stay, but what had he achieved? Returning home was out of the question. Firstly, Crispo had accumulated debts over the years in the capital city. He would have to repay them for a long time, and salaries in the capital were considerably higher than what he could earn back in his hometown. Crispo understood that if he returned home, he would never climb out of the financial hole he had dug for himself, and there was no one left to help him now. In the past, his grandfather had been a respected and well-known figure in the town as the chief physician of the local hospital. But now he was retired, ill, old, and weak. His grandfather required care and attention himself. Secondly, how could he possibly return after he had assured his friends that life in the countryside wasn't for him, after his contemptuous words about his hometown, and after, let's be honest, his boasting among acquaintances? Crispo couldn't bear the thought of admitting his failure and incompetence to the entire town, acknowledging his own insignificance. Moreover, in the eyes of his old friends and relatives, Crispo was quite successful and accomplished. He lived in the capital in his own apartment and worked as an economist. He diligently cultivated the image of a person who was content with his life. He even posted photos on social media that, in his opinion, upheld the status of a well-to-do individual. It was amusing, of course, but sometimes the owner of the company where Crispo worked would host corporate events, and photos from luxurious restaurants would appear on Crispo's profile after such occasions. Once, a colleague of Crispo's arrived at work in an expensive foreign car that he had rented just to show off. Crispo took a selfie behind the wheel of that car and posted the photo on his profile the same evening. He laughed at himself. Crispo created the appearance of a life he had never actually lived on his social media page and received a multitude of likes and comments from acquaintances in his hometown. They were convinced that everything had worked out for Crispo and that the ambitious plans of his youth had been realized, and Crispo was perfectly fine with that. He wanted to at least be perceived as successful and happy in the minds of his friends and relatives. Crispo grew up without a father. His mother had him, as they say, for herself, or, to put it more simply and honestly, she got pregnant. Crispo was the result of a common resort romance between a senior college student and a young man who claimed to be a small business owner. Crispo didn't know who his father was, and he believed that he would never find out. This man was completely unaware he had a son, and he had probably long forgotten about the affair that had happened so many years ago, or perhaps he wasn't even alive anymore. Who knows? Crispo's mother didn't really know much about her resort lover either. She had no intention of having a serious relationship with him, so she didn't bother to inquire about the details of his life, his address, or his passport. She just wanted to have some fun, being away from her strict and controlling parents, and it all turned out quite differently in the end. Crispo was an unplanned but beloved child. His grandparents insisted that their daughter go through with the pregnancy, even though she initially considered having an abortion. Crispo suspected that it was his grandfather who saved his life. His grandfather was an authoritative, reliable, and principled man, and it was very difficult to argue with him. Perhaps it was hard for him to accept the fact that his daughter had become pregnant out of marriage, but his grandfather managed to overcome his own feelings and make such an important decision for the family. The reward for his grandfather was a grandson. He had always dreamed of having a son, but ended up raising two daughters. The elder of them gave him two wonderful granddaughters, and the younger one gave him the most pleasant and long-awaited surprise. She finally had a boy. Crispo's childhood was bright and happy, surrounded by loving relatives. His mother, though she didn't devote much attention to her son due to work and her attempts to establish her personal life, made him feel loved. She often gave him toys, took him to amusement parks, or to the movies. She was a festive person, cheerful, energetic, and full of ideas and plans. His mother filled him with optimism and a love for life, and as for his grandparents, they adored him unconditionally. Crispo later realized that his grandmother had deep compassion for him. After all, he was a boy growing up without a father, and his mother didn't pay much attention to him. They had some warm moments together before she disappeared again. That's why his grandmother tried to compensate for the lack of parental affection by preparing delicious dishes, reading bedtime stories, and spending hours with him on playgrounds around the city. His grandmother was like warmth, unconditional love, and complete acceptance for him. Whatever Crispo did, she was always on his side, even if her beloved grandson was somehow at fault. If Crispo got into a fight, his grandmother unconditionally considered the other side to be a delinquent who had dared to hurt a good boy. If he received a bad grade, his grandmother took on the teacher's prejudice. Crispo loved his grandmother too. It was nice to know that there was someone in the world for whom you were a ray of sunshine, the best, the most beautiful, and the smartest. With his grandfather, Crispo had a different relationship. His grandfather didn't particularly encourage misbehavior. He could scold his grandson or even give him a light slap with his wife's approval. His grandfather set boundaries, and paradoxically, this created a sense of security for Crispo. His grandfather was as solid as a rock, and his words carried weight. He often had heart-to-heart talks with Crispo on various topics: friendship, love, education, and life plans. These conversations began when Crispo was very young, and the boy cherished those moments. Furthermore, his grandfather often took his grandson to work, where the boy saw how much respect other people had for his grandfather, and he felt proud of his relative. Crispo understood that his grandfather was doing a very important job and doing it well. His grandfather took Crispo fishing and into the woods, and sometimes they spent entire days in the garage, dismantling the old family car. Crispo suspected that his grandfather could have bought a newer car, but apparently that faithful old car was more valuable for him. The older relative did his best to compensate for Crispo's lack of paternal attention, and he succeeded brilliantly. Crispo adored his grandfather, and in his childhood, he dreamed of becoming just like him. When Crispo was around 6 years old, he saw a performance of a famous rock band on television, and the spectacle captivated him so much that he didn't even hear his grandmother calling him for dinner. From then on, Crispo never parted with a plastic shovel, holding it like a guitar and singing and dancing just like the guys on TV. The adults laughed and clapped their hands. They were sure that Crispo would outgrow it, but he didn't. At first, the boy just listened to rock compositions, then he started singing along. His grandmother was the first to notice that her grandson had a sense of pitch and a good voice, so she enrolled him in a music school. Crispo got disappointed there. He had imagined things very differently, thinking that the school would have a stage and men dressed in jeans with guitars. But he had to spend hours playing the piano. It was unbearable, and Crispo began to hate school after just 2 or 3 classes. However, his grandmother, always gentle and accommodating, suddenly displayed determination. She thought her grandson would become a musician because his teacher assured her that Crispo had talent and an innate sense of rhythm, but laziness was ruining it. His grandmother didn't want to squander Crispo's talent, so she made him attend the music school for 3 years, and then, with his grandfather's support, he finally left the dismal institution. His grandmother regretted his decision for a long time. She had envisioned him on posters as a great pianist. But Crispo had completely different dreams when it came to the stage. His grandfather, who saw and understood everything, gave his grandson a guitar for New Year's, a real, beautiful one. Crispo gradually learned to pick out melodies, sometimes observing his favorite performers, sometimes figuring things out on his own, but also diligently practicing with the help of instructional books. The boy was happy. He enjoyed this form of education. There were no mentoring instructions, no unnecessary lessons like music theory or music literature, no obligations or exams. Now the boy would spend hours in his room selecting compositions, and it worked out well. Perhaps his father was musical, his grandmother said sometimes. In our family, it seems like we all miss the musical talent, but Crispo clearly has it. Crispo liked to imagine that his father was one of those rock musicians who played in packed stadiums. He even searched for similarities between himself and the popular rock stars of the time, and somehow he managed to find some. In school, Crispo didn't excel, but he also didn't receive any failing grades. His mother and grandmother initially dreamed that Crispo would follow in his grandfather's footsteps and become a doctor, but by the time he reached middle school, it was clear that the boy didn't have the necessary inclinations and abilities. His grandfather, on the other hand, wasn't concerned at all. He believed that everyone had their own path, and it was the role of adult relatives to help the child discover their future and identify their talents, which could eventually turn into a profession. Nobody took Crispo's guitar playing seriously, so one day, during a family council meeting, it was decided that Crispo would become a student at an economics university. Why not? It was considered a promising and lucrative profession, just right for a young man. Crispo didn't object, mainly because he had no ambitions or plans for the future. He had chosen to become an economist, and it didn't sound too bad. Studying at a university was better than joining the army, and, in general, Crispo thought that the life of the students was an endless celebration, parties, new friends, and acquaintances. He couldn't wait for it to begin. Crispo liked university life right away. It seemed like there was suddenly less control, as if his relatives had begun to consider the only grandson and son as adults. His grandfather even started giving him more pocket money. It was wonderful. Everything was just as Crispo had imagined: parties, gatherings at rented apartments of fellow students, and visits to nightclubs. Finally, it was happening. It was at this point that Crispo's ability to handle a guitar came in handy. It was great to sit in someone's kitchen and sing cheerful or even naughty songs. Crispo, the guitarist, was always the center of attention, and he was quite proud of himself. With his good looks and cheerful personality from a good family, he naturally caught the eye of many girls. In school, Crispo hadn't been particularly popular, but in university, he suddenly became a desirable bachelor. Of course, he took full advantage of it, starting romantic relationships, enjoying his youth, and exercising his freedom. One day, while wandering through the city at night, a group of friends led by Crispo ended up in a rock bar. Crispo had no idea that such a place existed in the city. The bar was located in the basement of one of the buildings in the city center, an inconspicuous sign with minimal advertising. However, inside, it turned out to be a real treasure: several not very spacious but cozy rooms with soft, comfortable chairs and photos of rock musicians on the walls, a long bar with high stools, and a stage with a microphone in the largest of the rooms. Local musicians, bands, and soloists performed here every evening, playing both well-known songs and original compositions. There was a special atmosphere here. The regular visitors to the bar seemed to have known each other for a long time, forming a cohesive and harmonious group. Crispo immediately wanted to become a part of it. This was the very dream he wanted to live in. Since then, Crispo has started visiting this bar regularly. He watched the musicians' performances with bated breath and applauded them so vigorously that his palms would burn. Crispo sang along with the soloists and sometimes even danced. It depended on his mood. Gradually, Crispo became part of the bar's community. He got to know the musicians, and sometimes they even allowed him on stage between sets. Crispo played for the bar's patrons and felt the reciprocal wave of energy coming from the audience. It was magnificent. Crispo tried to join some of the musical groups, as playing concerts with a rock band had been his dream since childhood. However, no offers to collaborate came his way. And when Crispo tried to offer his services, he was gently and tactfully turned down without causing offense. Crispo lacked something to fulfill his dream, perhaps charisma, perhaps talent, or maybe both. He had to accept it, but the rock musicians remained his idols and demigods. He enjoyed socializing in this environment, listening to their conversations and helping them with their performances. In this rock bar, Crispo met Helia. He still remembered that evening. It was the end of May, during the break between university exams. Crispo, as always, had barely managed to extricate himself from the troubles he had created for himself. Throughout the semester, he had neglected his studies, and on the eve of the exams, he suddenly realized that he had to start cramming. Some subjects required him to study hard, for others, he had to pay. Some exams even required him to work off extra credit hours. So, on that day, Crispo spent the whole day doing just that. His legs and back were aching from the unusual physical exertion, but now he had the necessary and important professor's signature on his exam record. Crispo decided to visit his favorite rock bar after a hard day. He went there alone since all his friends were occupied. Some had gone on dates with their girlfriends. It was Friday, after all, and others were diligently preparing for their next exams. But Crispo wasn't worried, as he had plenty of acquaintances in the rock bar, so he wouldn't be bored. And indeed, as soon as Crispo entered, Bacho, a regular at the bar, greeted him. Bacho and his friends were sitting in the sandy hall at a corner table. Crispo happily joined them, and they engaged in jokes, conversations about life, and friendly teasing. The evening was going on as usual until Helia entered the hall. She was a short, slender girl dressed in the uniform of a waitress, black shorts, a black t-shirt, a long gray apron, and a name tag on her chest. Her long chestnut hair was tied up in a high ponytail, and her face had minimal makeup. It was unnecessary for her. Nature had already painted her face with bright colors, black eyebrows extending outward, long black eyelashes, peachy-toned skin, and enormous eyes of an unreal light turquoise color. This unusual combination of colors caught Crispo's attention. "She's a new waitress, she just started working yesterday." Bacho followed his friend's gaze and understood everything. "She's cute, I agree, but I liked Alba more. It's a shame she quit." Crispo absent-mindedly nodded while Bacho was talking, but all his attention was focused on the new waitress. He couldn't even understand what drew him to her. Sure, she was pretty, but he had seen prettier girls at the university. She was almost too skinny. As Eusebio would say, nothing to hold on to. But Crispo couldn't take his eyes off her. Then it dawned on him, it was her smile that captivated him, radiant and at the same time somewhat modest and very warm, as if it illuminated the girl's face and made her even more attractive. Crispo wanted to see that smile all the time, and what's more, he dreamed of being the one who could make her smile. It was a strange feeling. He had never felt this way before. That evening, Crispo didn't dare speak to the girl, which had never happened to him recently. In school, he used to get shy when he was around girls, as he didn't know how to communicate with them and was even slightly afraid of them. But now, with some experience under his belt, he still found himself getting flustered and becoming quiet in the presence of the new waitress. Of course, after some time, Crispo gathered the courage to speak to Helia. That evening, he deliberately came to the bar to have a conversation with her. He came alone, without his friends, as he didn't need them at that moment. Helia looked tired or sad for some reason, and then one of the guests, not a regular but a random customer, expressed dissatisfaction with her service. She had brought the customer the wrong beer, which had caused a loud commotion. The customer demanded his beer and refused to accept anything else. Helia looked flustered, and she would have to return the drink and admit her mistake to the manager, not a pleasant situation. "Miss, put this beer on my tab," Crispo said. "And please bring this young man what he ordered." Helia broke into a grateful smile that warmed Crispo's heart. It brought him joy to help the girl and to support her in some way. During that evening, Crispo and Helia exchanged jokes and smiles. Something special had developed between them. Crispo could feel it, and it seemed that Helia was drawn to him as well, and it was simply wonderful. They didn't get a chance to talk during her shift since it was a busy night with many guests. However, Crispo patiently waited until her shift ended and offered to walk her home. It turned out that she rented an apartment just 2 districts away from the bar, and the young couple, holding hands, strolled through the awakening city streets. They felt happy and content. At first, they walked in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable or awkward. Instead, it was relaxed and peaceful. Neither Helia nor Crispo felt a hint of embarrassment. Then, suddenly, they both started talking. They began by discussing the events of the evening and the performance of the local rock band, which consisted of former high school students. Helia and Crispo agreed that the boys had a bright future ahead of them if they continued in the same spirit. Finally, Crispo mustered the courage for a more candid conversation. "And you, do you have someone?" "No, I'm single." Helia replied quickly. "How about you?" Crispo couldn't answer that question definitively. He had always been involved with someone, and at the moment, he was casually seeing Katerina, a girl from a different class. They had gone on a few dates, but for Helia, he would easily give up all his other relationships. This girl was pulling him in more and more. Crispo asked her to tell him more about herself. He wanted to learn more about this mysterious beauty who had left such a strong impression on him. Crispo was experiencing feelings he had never encountered before, which both delighted and confused him. Helia talked about her life simply and sincerely, and Crispo listened attentively, hanging on to every word. He liked everything about her, from her way of speaking to her gentle and calm tone and her facial expressions. He was captivated by all of it. There was nothing he didn't like about this girl, absolutely nothing. Crispo didn't want to part with her. He hoped the walk to her home would be very long. He learned that Helia was born and raised in a village, and her family home was almost 100 kilometers away. It was a cozy and quiet place, but not suitable for young people. Like most of her friends, after finishing high school, Helia started searching for happiness in the nearest city. She enrolled in a teacher's college, not out of a personal calling, but simply because she had to choose something. She completed her education, received her diploma, but couldn't work in her profession. She quit after a few months of working as a teacher. "I realized that teaching is not for me," Helia shared her memories. "I couldn't convey to those little kids how to solve math problems or write essays. I can do all of that perfectly myself, but I couldn't teach and engage the children. It's one thing to study in college, another thing entirely to apply it in practice. It's like night and day." Helia didn't want to take on such responsibility. She was afraid of scaring the children away and extinguishing their desire to learn. So she quit and worked for a while at a private educational center where they needed a young and attractive woman with a pedagogical background. It was nothing like school. There was less pressure here, and Helia could experiment with teaching methods. But eventually, the center went bankrupt and closed down, leaving Helia jobless. "Then I happened to see an ad for a waitress position at the bar, and I applied," Helia continued. "I'm so glad that your center closed down," Crispo admitted. "Because if it hadn't, we would have never met." Crispo and Helia began dating. The quiet, modest Helia, with her radiant smile and gentle demeanor, had completely won the heart of the young man. And she loved him back with all her heart and soul, doing everything to make Crispo feel happy in her company, sometimes sacrificing her own desires and leisure. Crispo quickly moved into Helia's rented apartment, and they started living together. Crispo's family wasn't very pleased with it, but there was nothing they could do. Crispo was already a grown man, and he did what he wanted. Crispo continued his studies at the university, while Helia continued working as a waitress. Their total income, so to speak, Helia's salary and Crispo's scholarship, along with financial support from their respective families, provided them with enough money to get by. Crispo felt fulfilled by Helia's care and love, believing that this girl accepted him along with all his flaws. In fact, she loved those flaws and saw them as strengths, which was paradoxical but heartwarming. Crispo was basking in Helia's affection and attention, feeling like he was the center of her world. It was incredibly pleasant. But then Crispo couldn't understand why, but things started to change slowly and gradually. At first, Helia's care stopped warming his heart. Crispo had become accustomed to her adoration and attention. She made his favorite breakfast and prepared special dinners for him, and somehow, it became the norm. Helia's admiration and interest no longer ignited the same feelings in him. Initially, Helia had appeared as a mystery to Crispo, a beautiful, quiet, and modest girl with strikingly expressive eyes, a captivating combination. However, over time, Crispo discovered that there was nothing particularly unique about Helia. She was just an ordinary girl and perhaps a bit dull. Crispo had always been drawn to unconventional personalities, fearing mediocrity and monotony. With time, Crispo himself couldn't understand why, but everything began to change, slowly and subtly. Crispo even had his idol, Antonio Rey, who was 10 years older than him. By the way, Antonio had graduated from the same school as Crispo did. However, he didn't follow the path of most average students who went to college at the time. Instead, he formed his own band and headed to the capital city, where Antonio had a meteoric career. While he didn't become a top-tier star, he gained significant fame. His rock band songs played on the radio, the musicians held concerts all over the country, and they even had their own army of fans. Antonio possessed a sharp mind and incredible charisma, and Crispo knew him personally. Antonio often visited his hometown because his parents still lived there. Every time he came back, he frequented the rock bar where he was a cherished guest, catching up with old friends and listening to local musicians. Antonio was known and loved by everyone in town, and Crispo considered himself a fan. He admired everything about Antonio: his warm smile, his way of interacting with people, his determined gaze, and Antonio's captivating eyes, sad and contemplative. It seemed like he could see right through everyone with those eyes. Crispo wanted to be like Antonio. He even tried to imitate him, but quickly realized that he couldn't. Antonio was unique. He was a star, a singer, and a leader. That evening, Helia was on shift, and Crispo also went to the bar to meet his friends and listen to a new rock band that had promising reviews. As the evening went on, closer to midnight, Crispo suddenly felt a sense of excitement. When he turned around, he saw Antonio. Antonio was walking towards his favorite table with a few friends, politely greeting his acquaintances. Crispo was thrilled. He knew this would be an exciting night. Antonio was a party in himself, and Crispo was sure to have a chance to talk to him later, when the right moment presented itself. Deep down, Crispo still held onto the hope that Antonio might help him, perhaps get him on stage or put in a good word for him with someone. After all, Antonio was influential, with numerous connections and acquaintances. Maybe Antonio would even consider taking him into his band, not as a core member but as a backup. Antonio was living the life Crispo had always dreamed of: touring, performing, rehearsing, socializing with interesting people and beautiful women, and most importantly, being on stage. Antonio filled stadiums, had crowds singing along, and was adored by thousands of eyes. What happiness! Crispo had come to the realization that becoming a rock musician wasn't on the cards for him by the time he reached his last year of university. And maybe it was too late to start at his age. But every time he saw Antonio, Crispo couldn't help but think about his dream. A glimmer of hope would awaken in him. Helia was serving Antonio's table, smiling at him as she did with all customers, and he occasionally exchanged a few words with her. Crispo couldn't hear what they were saying, but judging by Helia's expression, it seemed to be something pleasant. To his surprise, Crispo suddenly realized that he didn't like seeing his girlfriend chatting so comfortably with Antonio. It wasn't jealousy, no. Crispo understood that Antonio was surrounded by beautiful women of various types, all willing to do anything for him. Why would he choose the provincial girl, Helia? Yes, she was definitely a provincial girl now that Crispo had lived with her for a few months. He couldn't see anything particularly exceptional about her appearance. After all, he himself didn't understand what had attracted him to her in the first place. Crispo was uncomfortable seeing his girlfriend talking with Antonio so casually. He had to wait patiently for the right moment, and Helia was chatting with Antonio so effortlessly and naturally, as if she didn't realize who he was. Or perhaps she genuinely didn't know. Several more hours passed, and Crispo decided it was time to have a conversation with his idol. He headed towards Antonio's table. At that very moment, Helia rushed to attend to Antonio's table with an order, and in her clumsiness, she nearly bumped into Crispo, but she managed to save the glasses of beer without spilling a drop. Helia's quick reaction saved the situation, but Crispo couldn't help but make an irritated remark. "You're as clumsy as an elephant." The expression slipped out of his mouth automatically. These were the same words his mother usually used to scold Crispo when he dropped or spilled something. Helia felt embarrassed, and she didn't appreciate Crispo drawing everyone's attention to her mistake. If it weren't for his cutting remark, no one would have noticed. "Why would you say that?" Antonio smiled reassuringly at Helia. "Why do you call her an elephant? She's a very lovely and delicate lady." Crispo glared at Helia, and after Antonio's words, she suddenly began to irritate him even more. Sensing this, she withdrew. The rest of the evening went wonderfully for Crispo, as he enjoyed his time in the company of Antonio and his friends. Listening to their stories of their wild youth and concerts in the capital was fascinating. They had been through all sorts of adventures in their time, enough material for a movie. Crispo loved feeling like a part of this group, even if only for one evening. These people lived brightly, loudly, and laughed wholeheartedly. Helia's shift ended, and she approached Crispo, inviting him to come home together, as they usually did. But this time, he waved her off. He wasn't in the mood for her right now. "Is she your girlfriend?" Antonio asked. "No, she's just a fan," Crispo replied, not caring about Helia's feelings. She was standing right there and overheard everything, but he didn't care at the moment. The last thing he wanted was for Antonio to find out he was in a serious relationship with the simple waitress. "You're lucky. I wish I had fans like that," Antonio said, winking at Helia. She sadly smiled and went to the staff room to change. She was tired and just wanted to go home as soon as possible. Crispo arrived at the apartment where he had been living with Helia for several months. He thought that Helia would create a scene or, at the very least, demand an explanation. After all, he had treated her very poorly, calling her an elephant and not calling her his girlfriend in front of others. But Helia acted as if nothing had happened. She didn't say a word to Crispo, and later, after he had gotten some rest, she looked at him with the same love and tenderness as before, taking care of him. Helia's admiration and attention, which had previously been seen as a gift of fate, now irritated Crispo. What had once seemed like her strengths had turned into her flaws. Her care had become clinginess, her natural beauty had become rustic simplicity, and her modesty had become inhibition. Yet, Crispo didn't rush to break up with Helia. She was convenient for him. She provided him with a place to live, cooked delicious meals, and even ironed his shirts, all without controlling his every move as his family did. She didn't demand reports or restrict him, unlike his relatives. Living with her felt much freer than being in his own home with his grandmother, grandfather, and mother. However, Crispo dreamt of more. He saw himself as a successful, accomplished man with a stunningly beautiful woman with a model-like appearance by his side, not Helia from the countryside. Crispo eagerly awaited the end of his university studies to finally move to the capital and start a new life there. He didn't see Helia in his future, she was just a stopover, nothing more. But a bizarre twist of fate almost shattered Crispo's plans. "We need to have a serious talk," Helia greeted Crispo one day as he returned from university. He had just sat through 5 consecutive classes, so he had neither the energy nor the desire to engage in conversation with her. However, she displayed unusual persistence. "Okay," Crispo sighed, realizing he had no way out. "I'm expecting a child." Helia lowered her gaze, clearly feeling very embarrassed. Crispo felt like a bucket of cold water had been poured over him. "What do you mean?" I don't understand. What don't you understand? It's simple, I'm pregnant. Is this certain? Crispo asked hopefully. It couldn't be more certain. What a twist. What about the capital? What about Crispo's plans and dreams? Were they all over now? Crispo tried to persuade Helia to consider an abortion, arguing that they were too young to become parents. A child needed grown-up parents, and they were still practically children themselves. I'm not ready, he honestly admitted. I mean, what kind of father would I make? I haven't even finished university yet. I understand, Helia sighed heavily. You don't need to worry, I'll raise the child on my own. She looked so miserable and lost, and how could she do it alone? Crispo understood perfectly well that Helia wouldn't be able to handle it, just as he knew he couldn't abandon her or their child. From a very young age, Crispo had heard unflattering comments about his father. This man had no idea about the existence of his son, yet he was still considered a scoundrel because he didn't participate in raising him. His grandfather, mother, and grandmother had collectively instilled a simple rule in Crispo's mind: you must never abandon your children under any circumstances. Anyone who does so is unworthy of respect, love, and a happy life. It's the gravest sin a man can commit. And now Crispo found himself in almost the same situation as his father once did. A girl he had simply been having fun with was pregnant, and they hadn't planned on a serious relationship. However, unlike his father, Crispo couldn't disappear across the vast expanse of the country. He couldn't escape the consequences. No, of course, Helia wouldn't pursue him. She wasn't trying to deceive him when she said she would raise the child alone. But Crispo's conscience wouldn't allow him to walk away from this situation. Well, I guess we'll have to start preparing for the wedding, Crispo sighed and forced a smile. What else could he do? He had to adapt to the new circumstances. After all, if you think about it, Helia wasn't solely to blame for this situation. Crispo himself had played a part in it. While Helia wasn't exactly his ideal match, he could live with her. She was resourceful, quiet, and caring, and she'd probably make a good mother. As for the capital, it would still be there, waiting. It wasn't going anywhere, and Crispo was determined to achieve his goals. He tried to reassure himself with these thoughts. So what if there was a child on the way? The most important thing was that the child would be born within wedlock, maintaining propriety. Later, they could get divorced, and he could pursue his previous plans. True, he'd have to pay child support for a whole 18 years, but that wouldn't be a problem. Crispo would have such a good income that these mandatory deductions wouldn't affect him. Helia hugged Crispo and snuggled up to him. I knew I could count on you. I knew you were reliable. In the past, such an admission would have thrilled him and filled him with energy and joy, but now Helia seemed like an obstacle, a millstone around his neck, a problem. So he remained silent. Crispo introduced Helia to his relatives. The wedding was just around the corner. She immediately won their hearts, especially his grandmother, who tirelessly praised her grandson's bride and repeated how incredibly lucky Crispo was to have met such a girl. The wedding preparations began, and Helia looked so happy and enthusiastic. Her joyous demeanor irritated Crispo, and conversations about the impending celebration drove him crazy. Everyone around him was rejoicing, but he felt like a trapped animal. All his plans had crumbled because of her and because of Helia. He almost graduated from the university and had a diploma. He'd aced his final exams, and now was the perfect time to get on a train and leave for a new life. But then this, a wedding, a radiant Helia, and a child. Helia continued to work at the bar, but Crispo decided to take a break after the grueling final stretch, first the exams, then the diploma. He figured he had time to earn some money before Helia would be on maternity leave, and he, Crispo, would have to support the family. More than usual, Crispo went to the rock bar to hang out with friends and have a drink or two. He watched with envy the young and not-so-young musicians performing on stage. Some of them would remain in this forgotten little town, while others were destined for a bright future, like Antonio. Watching these people, Crispo began to realize that he hadn't handled his life as he should have. A person is born and lives only once, and there's no time for things or people you don't love. But obligations kept Crispo trapped, as if in a snare. He was yearning for a change in his life and prospects. His friends had no inkling of his true feelings. They thought he was just a bit nervous about the wedding and impending parenthood. That was normal, right? Crispo didn't try to convince them otherwise, suffering alone and desperately hoping that he could make up for it all, not now, but later, in a couple of years. His plans weren't canceled, just postponed, as long as this swamp didn't trap him whole. On one of those evenings at the bar when Helia stayed at home, Crispo enjoyed even a semblance of freedom and met Juana, tall, stunningly beautiful, with long hair cascading in waves down to her waist, tight jeans that accentuated her flat stomach, and a revealing top. She was in the company of her friends. They were attractive girls too, but all their merits faded in comparison to Juana's beauty. Crispo couldn't take his eyes off her from the moment she entered the room, and he wasn't the only one. His friends had already left, but Crispo remained at his table, sipping his beer and observing. He liked everything about her smile, her loud, infectious laughter, her gestures. Juana was clearly the leader among her friends and in life in general, it seemed. A couple of times, she caught Crispo's gaze, and then a little miracle happened. She invited him over to her table. Most of her friends had already dispersed by that time, leaving only two silent girls who didn't interfere with Juana and Crispo's conversation. During their conversation, it became apparent that the young people had a lot in common. Juana was a couple of years younger than Crispo and had also been raised without a father. Her grandmother and mother insisted that she enroll in the local university's law school after high school, but all she had ever dreamed of was becoming an actress. She was drawn to the stage, the creative environment, and city life. "You really will become an excellent actress," Crispo sincerely assured his new acquaintance. "With your beauty, directors will be fighting over you." "Thank you," Juana replied with a smile, unfazed. "I thought the same, but at that age, I wasn't ready to argue with my mom and grandma, not like I am now." Juana initially followed the wishes of her elder relatives, but as she grew older and stronger, she declared that she was an adult and wouldn't let anyone manipulate her or dictate her life choices. "In short, I picked up my documents from the university today, and I won't be going back there. In a couple of days, I'm taking a train and leaving for the capital for good. Even if I don't become an actress, I won't be coming back here," Juana declared. Crispo admired her determination. Unlike him, she hadn't abandoned her dream despite external pressure. She wasn't afraid to leave her university behind and venture into the unknown. In this, she was like Antonio. And with her appearance, character, and determination, Juana would undoubtedly succeed. Suddenly, Juana surprised Crispo by leaning in and kissing him. His head spun from the unexpectedness of it all. Could it be true that such an amazing girl was interested in him? "You're amazing," Crispo told Juana after she leaned back a bit. Her enormous dark eyes resembled two deep whirlpools. It was so easy to get lost in them. "Maybe you'd like some company. How about we go to the capital together? It seems you, too, are feeling confined in this town. It would be easier for both of us if we were together." Crispo stared at his beautiful companion in astonishment. She had understood him so well and grasped everything about him so quickly. "Yes, of course," he nodded. "I'm with you." At the moment Crispo said this, he sincerely believed that he would deal with the problems with Helia and the wedding later, that he would come up with something. He couldn't possibly turn down such an amazing girl. Perhaps he would never meet anyone like Juana again, and he was almost certain of that because there surely weren't many like her. That evening, Crispo left the rock bar with Juana. She was behind the wheel of her own old foreign car, a gift from her grandfather for enrolling in the law faculty. Juana drove incredibly well, and Crispo was mesmerized by her confident movements and graceful profile. They ended up in a remote field, a deserted, empty place. Juana turned off the engine, turned to Crispo, and smiled. How could he resist? They welcomed the dawn lying in each other's arms on the unfolded seats. At that moment, Crispo had no doubt he would break up with Helia. He wouldn't reject his child, of course, but there would definitely be no wedding. However, it wasn't that simple to tell Helia the truth. But Crispo didn't want to deceive her either. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He had met someone else and fallen in love. It happens in life. He was not Helia's property. He was a free person who could live his life as he pleased. But Helia looked at Crispo with such eyes. They held hope, adoration, love, and tenderness. It was hard to speak the truth when faced with those devoted eyes. Crispo felt like the worst person in the world when he finally shared the news with his former fiancée. Helia crumpled up as if Crispo's words caused her physical pain. Tears welled up in her eyes. "You're rushing this. You don't even know this, Juana. She's a beautiful girl. You're young. I understand that. It might be a passing fling, but why make hasty decisions? If you want to go to the capital so badly, let's go together." "There's nothing holding me here," Helia pleaded. Crispo felt anger boiling up inside him. Couldn't this girl understand anything? He wanted to go to the capital to start a new life, the one he had dreamed of for so long. Maybe he would make it as a rock musician. If not, he could still work in his recently acquired profession. The capital was a city of great opportunities. He wouldn't lose anything. And he certainly didn't need the burden of an annoying Helia and a baby. Helia cried, begged, and apologized. Crispo still couldn't figure out what for. He was getting angrier and began insulting her, trying to hurt her as much as possible. He knew he was treating her cruelly, but these harsh words were his way of severing ties with a tiresome girlfriend and pushing her away. She irritated him and truly got on his nerves. Crispo recalled everything about Helia, her rural background, her not always correct words, her narrow outlook. He accused his former fiancée of lacking ambition and called her a dumb chicken, a burden, and an anchor. And Helia just nodded in response to all these insults, agreed, and promised to change. Another person in her place might have become angry and started calling her unfaithful fiancé names in return, but not her. She clung to Crispo with all her might and was willing to forgive him absolutely everything. It was actually a bit flattering. With Helia, Crispo felt like a prized possession, almost a deity, and he liked how hard she fought for him. Crispo knew he was humiliating the girl, but he couldn't stop himself. He was taking revenge on Helia for the trouble she had caused him, and he was asserting himself. In the end, Crispo stormed out of Helia's apartment, slamming the door. At that moment, he felt light and free. Of course, the child wouldn't disappear, and he would have to pay child support and maybe even have contact with the baby. Crispo didn't want to be seen as the same mythical figure as his own father in the eyes of his son or daughter. Certainly, he wouldn't abandon the child. He would be present in their life from time to time and, of course, provide for them. Someday, this little person would understand everything and be proud of their successful, resolute father. Crispo decided not to explain anything to his relatives. Things probably wouldn't have gone as smoothly as with Helia. He would call them later and explain everything when he was already in place. He would leave a note as well and, by the way, ask them to look after Helia and the baby. No matter how hard he tried, Crispo couldn't get the child out of his thoughts. He already felt a responsibility for this little life. On the day before his departure, Crispo stayed with his friend, and then, at the train station, Juana's radiant eyes embarked on a new life with just a backpack on her shoulders. Crispo withdrew all his savings. His grandfather had been setting aside a substantial amount for him every year, calling it a starting capital that every man needed. Now, this money came in handy. Crispo used it to rent an apartment for himself and Juana. They lived on it for a while, until they found jobs. His grandfather, grandmother, and mother kept trying to call Crispo. They probably wanted to express their outrage at his actions, hoping to influence him and maybe even persuade him to return home. But Crispo ignored those calls. He had explained everything to them in a letter, and he had no desire to talk to his relatives while they were still upset. He believed that with time, emotions would subside, everything would settle down, Crispo would find work, establish himself in the capital, and then they could have a conversation. But for now, it wasn't the right time. Juana believed that Crispo was doing the right thing. Elder relatives often, without realizing it, drag us down. They try to confine us to their own framework, wanting their children to live by their rules, but we are not their property, and we are not obligated to structure our lives according to their wishes. We are separate individuals, adults, she said thoughtfully when Crispo declined yet another call from his mother. Crispo agreed with every word Juana said. However, their time together didn't last long. The young beauty quickly found a wealthy benefactor in the capital and left Crispo without much hesitation. Crispo felt abandoned, humiliated, and lost, and he experienced almost physical pain from Juana's betrayal. He had thought that he had finally met a kindred spirit. Juana understood him like no one else, and he agreed with everything she said. Such connections were rare, and it seemed like the two of them could overcome everything together and conquer the capital side by side, but then this happened. However, Crispo couldn't dwell on his feelings for long. He needed to settle into his new location and find a more lucrative job. Returning home was out of the question. After more than a month of fruitless job hunting, Crispo finally got lucky. He was hired as a junior economist at a not-so-successful but definitely reliable company. Crispo believed that it was just the beginning, the start of his path to a successful, prosperous life. However, over 10 years had passed, and he was still in the same place. Crispo continued to work in a non-prestigious position, with little career advancement and no clear prospects. Then, after obtaining a good job, Crispo finally called his mother. He was prepared for a serious conversation. His mother would shout and accuse him, perhaps even demand that he return, but she surprised Crispo with what she said. Helia was so distraught because of your betrayal that she lost the baby. She ended up in the hospital and barely survived. We called you to tell you that Helia was in the intensive care unit, but you never answered. Crispo processed the news, and strangely, he felt a deep pain at the thought that the child was no longer there. In theory, he should have been happy, the problem had resolved itself, but he experienced a mix of pain, disappointment, and indescribable longing. Crispo had gone through it, of course, and now it was easier to turn the page and start a new life. Crispo worked a lot and saved money whenever possible. His life consisted of reports and commuting back and forth from the office to home. There were no parties, no exciting new acquaintances, and certainly no beautiful women. Crispo had completely abandoned his guitar. It now gathered dust in a corner and used and forgotten. He had neither the time nor the mood for it. A couple of years later, Crispo managed to get a small mortgage for an old, run-down apartment on the outskirts, but it was his own place. Relatives helped with the down payment, the rest was up to him. At the time, Crispo was genuinely excited, believing that he was getting a fresh start. But as time passed, nothing changed. Crispo continued to live in a tiny two-room apartment on the outskirts of the capital, spending a lot of time commuting, living from paycheck to paycheck, and cutting costs wherever he could. Only on social media did he carefully craft the image of a successful, accomplished man. It seemed fine. Crispo knew that friends and relatives were watching him, thinking that everything was going well for their hometown boy. Crispo's personal life didn't progress. He had occasional flings, but all those women, without exception, were just passing through. Like Juana, they needed a place to stay temporarily, and Crispo's apartment served as a transit point. He understood this and now, with nostalgia, remembered Helia, her care, tenderness, love, sensitivity, and respect. With her, Crispo felt like a king. She gave him wings, while others merely used him. Crispo understood this and agreed, but he had no other choice. Then, one day, Crispo got a call from an old friend, Eusebio. They had been close friends since their school days, and they hadn't seen each other much since Crispo's departure. Life had taken them in different directions, but they still shared many memories, a common childhood and youth, and all of that didn't just disappear. Now, it turned out that Eusebio was finally settling down. He was getting married soon and invited his childhood friend, who now lived in the capital, to the celebration. So, will you find time for an old friend in your busy schedule? We haven't seen each other in ages, and now there's such a reason, Eusebio semi-jokingly said, once again convincing Crispo that in his hometown, they considered him a well-established and happy man. Crispo hadn't visited his hometown in all these years. His mother, grandmother, and grandfather had come to visit him several times, but for some reason, he had no desire to return. However, now, suddenly, Crispo felt that he was ready to see his hometown again, meet old friends, and be seen as a successful guest from the capital, someone who had built a career and escaped from obscurity. It was so great. Of course, I'll be there, Eusebio. Crispo arrived in his hometown late in the evening, opting not to take a taxi and instead deciding to walk. Not much had changed here, the same dusty, cracked sidewalks, lush greenery everywhere, familiar streets, parks, and squares. Strange feelings overwhelmed him. He longed for his former self, the young man full of plans and hopes. It seemed like he was different from the rest. They were ordinary, staying in this town, while he, Crispo, would be someone like Antonio, someone the locals would be proud of. But it didn't work out that way. Certainly, Crispo lived and worked in the capital, but it wasn't quite what he had once dreamed of. The locals, however, had no idea. At least for 1 week, Crispo would get to feel like the person he wanted to be in his youth, and that was comforting. His family welcomed their son and grandson warmly. They hadn't seen each other often recently. His grandmother and grandfather, the older relatives, had become quite old. Yet, once, they both seemed to Crispo to be energetic, strong, and all-powerful. Time spares no one, and his mother was no longer the beautiful young woman she used to be. Oh, these were the only people on the planet who cared about Crispo. When they were gone, he didn't even want to think about those days when he would be completely, utterly alone. The next day, Crispo met up with Eusebio and his fiancée. Valeriana turned out to be a very pleasant and attractive woman. Eusebio didn't let go of her hand. It was evident that he was wholeheartedly in love with his partner. Under Valeriana's blouse, there was a neat baby bump. Eusebio was about to become a father. That was quite the news. Crispo thought about how he might have had a teenage child by now if it weren't for. Who knows, maybe if that child had been born, Crispo would have returned from the capital when he realized that things weren't working out there. Perhaps he would have proposed to Helia, and they would all be together, living as a happy, big family. It was a pity that Crispo didn't understand in his youth that happiness was right there, readily available to him. He had chased after the mythical crane in the sky. The friendly gathering went wonderfully. Crispo, Eusebio, and their old friends were joined by their significant others. They were all serious and had families. Some had grown potbellies, while others had started going bald, mature family men, but still the same jokers and pranksters. Then Eusebio and Valeriana went home, and Crispo and his friends headed to the almost familiar rock bar. To Crispo's relief, not much had changed here either. Friends dropped by occasionally, and they were still regulars. It warmed his heart. Crispo played the role of a successful man diligently, treating his friends to beer and providing them with carefully crafted information about his life. He didn't lie, of course, but he presented the facts in a way that maintained the image of a man who had realized his youthful dreams. "You've done well, Crispo," Sergio clapped him on the shoulder. "I remember that in our youth, you used to say that this town wasn't for you and that you'd achieve more. And you did, you've achieved it. We all kind of envy you." Crispo smiled at his friend and remained silent. If only Sergio knew what there was to envy. And the next day was the wedding. Crispo arrived at the Registro Civil at the appointed time. A crowd of well-dressed guests, adult relatives, the newlyweds, and their friends were already there. Crispo was initially overwhelmed by the abundance of unfamiliar faces. Then his friends called out to him. They had all come to the celebration with their significant others, family-oriented, serious people, all of whom had children, jobs, apartments, and cars. Looking at his old friends standing hand in hand with their wives, Crispo once again felt that his own life was somehow aimless. The solemn ceremony, the obligatory stroll with the photographer to the city's memorable places. Champagne flowed like a river, guests had a great time, laughed, and showered the newlyweds with compliments. Eusebio and Valeriana genuinely looked great, beautiful, in love, and happy. Then it was time for the restaurant. By that time, Crispo had relaxed, getting acquainted with everyone he didn't know. The guests treated him warmly and friendly, inquired about the capital, and spoke respectfully about Crispo's career. It was all just as he had imagined. At the restaurant, a lively and cheerful master of ceremonies awaited the well-dressed crowd. On the porch, a new batch of guests gathered, and it was here that something that Crispo never expected happened. Among this group of newcomers, he saw Helia. At first, he couldn't believe his eyes, thinking it was a mirage, but how could she be here at all? Helia had changed, of course, during this time, but not so much that Crispo wouldn't recognize her. The same huge turquoise eyes, long, slightly wavy hair, slender, touching, almost translucent. Only now, there was confidence in Helia's gaze that made her face even more attractive. Helia was wearing a flowing dress of an amazing emerald hue that complemented her eyes perfectly. She had pinned her hair in a way that framed her beautiful face and cascaded down her graceful shoulders. She looked much younger than women her age and exuded warmth and energy. Crispo could even sense it from a distance. "Is that Helia?" Crispo asked Sergio, who was standing next to him. "What is she doing here?" "Helia? Eusebio invited her," his friend replied. Crispo smirked. Sergio didn't really help him much. At that moment, Helia also noticed him. Their eyes met, and Helia smiled. Her radiant smile had a strange effect on Crispo. On one hand, it charmed him. He had forgotten how beautiful Helia's smile was, radiant, warm, illuminating her face with a special light. On the other hand, anger welled up in him. Yes, he was angry at Helia. For some reason, he suddenly blamed her for his not-so-successful life. Helia had been just an annoying, clingy girl back then, demanding his attention but unwilling to give him space. It was because of her that he rushed to the capital when he wasn't fully ready for it. She was to blame for everything, and now Crispo was forced to lead a miserable existence. And here was Helia at the wedding, looking all beautiful, clearly successful, confident, and smiling at him with a sense of superiority. Crispo gave a dry nod to Helia and hurried to blend into the crowd, but now the celebration was not as enjoyable as before. Crispo watched from his seat as Helia enjoyed herself, easily mingling with the guests. Many knew her, and she laughed and danced, and several men invited her to dance. It wasn't surprising, but it was strange that she had come to the wedding alone. Sergio said that Eusebio had invited her. Why on earth had he done it? Was it because of him, Crispo? Helia clearly enjoyed life now, and it seemed that everything was going well for her. Her accessories, seemingly modest and unnoticeable earrings and a delicate necklace, were worth a fortune, not to mention her shoes with the unmistakable red soles from a high-end brand. Crispo recognized the signature sole. Helia didn't look like a small-town girl at all. She appeared modest yet expensive and refined. Local girls, on the other hand, preferred to shine at events like weddings with bold makeup, flashy clothing, and elaborate hairstyles. Helia stood out from them, and for some reason, it irritated Crispo. It seemed to him that Helia looked down on everyone, including himself. He was waiting for the right moment, and finally, there it was. Helia, carrying a tray, hurried towards an elderly lady, possibly the bride's grandmother. The lady seemed unwell due to the heat, and Helia noticed it. She rushed to the kitchen and returned with a tray containing a pitcher of cold water and a couple of glasses. Crispo hastened to approach his former bride. He wanted to humiliate her, and the perfect phrase had already formed in his mind. "Hello. You can't escape your past, can you? The waitress is still at work." These words were meant to remind Helia of her past and make her remember who she really was. Helia raised surprised eyes at Crispo, and it seemed like she was slightly flustered. That's it, all the external gloss had slipped off her. Helia hadn't changed at all, and it appeared that Crispo still had a significant influence on her, just like before. "Hello to you too," Helia whispered quietly. She placed the tray in front of the elderly lady and stepped away. Crispo, pleased with himself, returned to his seat, feeling almost happy. He managed to hurt Helia. Now she didn't look as arrogant and radiant. That was perfect. Crispo invited a young girl to dance, seemingly Valeriana's niece. The young lady had been casting amorous glances at the lone city guest all evening. Of course, she had fallen under the charm of the supposedly successful man. Young people were easily drawn to such things nowadays. Crispo decided to capitalize on the impression he had made on the girl and asked her to dance, to which she gladly agreed. He did it for Helia's sake, let her see how much fun he was having and how popular he was. Even young beauties were throwing themselves at him. It seemed Crispo had achieved the desired effect. Helia was watching him as he was dancing with the young cousin of the bride, her eyes filled with sadness. Perhaps she was jealous? Perhaps she still had some feelings for him. Crispo enjoyed thinking that, but it wasn't enough for him. He wanted to make others laugh at Helia. He didn't even understand why. Maybe by humiliating her, he felt more successful and significant. Silly, of course, but that's how it was. Crispo was discreetly watching Helia, waiting for the right moment, and finally, it happened. The girl didn't notice that someone had spilled champagne on the floor. She slipped, awkwardly waved her arms, and nearly fell. Many people saw that moment, and Helia almost lost her balance. At the last moment, she managed to grab onto a nearby column. Someone gasped, someone smiled, and Crispo loudly remarked, "Well, just as clumsy as an elephant." "Are you saying it again?" A familiar voice suddenly chimed in. Crispo shifted his gaze from Helia to the person who had appeared behind her, and he couldn't believe his eyes. It was Antonio. He had just arrived at the restaurant a few minutes ago, otherwise, Crispo would have noticed his idol sooner. Antonio, not taking his eyes off Crispo, extended his hand to Helia, helped her to her feet, and naturally, with a familiar gesture, put his arm around her waist. Crispo couldn't believe his eyes. Helia, for some reason, looked sad. "As clumsy as an elephant, you called her that back then, at the rock bar, remember?" Crispo nodded, even though that moment had completely faded from his memory. But if Antonio said so, then maybe it was true. "It all started with that phrase of yours." Antonio smiled at Helia. "So thank you, but don't talk to her like that again, or you'll have to deal with me." Antonio seemed like he was joking. He was smiling when he said it, but looked very serious. Stunned, Crispo returned to his seat, and the young lady, Valeriana's cousin, sat down next to him, chattering joyfully about something. Crispo wasn't really paying attention to her. He was watching Antonio, who was holding Helia's hand so gently. A crowd had gathered around them, and Eusebio was there too. Old acquaintances exchanged jokes and discussed something amusing, and Crispo couldn't bring himself to join them, even though he wanted to. He was too overwhelmed and confused. "What's going on here? I don't understand anything," he finally said. "That's Eusebio's friend, Antonio." "Eusebio has known him since they were kids. He's his idol," replied the young companion of Crispo. She turned out to be useful. Surely, this girl could provide him with some information. Valeriana's cousin happily shared all she knew. It turned out that Antonio, who had made quite a successful career in the capital, often visited his hometown. He had parents here who didn't want to leave their small hometown, and of course, friends. Antonio had continued to hang out with Eusebio and his friends all this time. They often met at the rock bar. Crispo would have been part of that crowd too if he hadn't left. So gradually, almost friendly relationships had developed between all of them. As for Helia, he had met her at the same rock bar. "I heard some guy insult her right in front of Antonio," the girl shared details. "And that's what made him notice her. He liked her right away and even wrote a lot of songs for her. In my opinion, those compositions of his meant for Helia are the most beautiful. But Helia seemed to be in love with someone else at the time. Some kind of unfortunate love affair happened to her. Strangely, who can resist Antonio? And she was hoping for something, waiting for her former boyfriend. He, as they say, didn't treat her very well. He left her just before the wedding, I think. She was in a terrible state back then. Valeriana said she was even hospitalized. I don't know what happened to her there. But Crispo knew. He knew why Helia ended up in the hospital. She lost her child because of the intense emotional distress she experienced. Eusebio and Valeriana told me later. Helia didn't return to work at the rock bar after that. She went to live with her relatives in the village, and Antonio found her through some acquaintances. He got her address and went there himself. It's an amazing story. I would have never believed that something like this could happen. How can't one ever stop believing in fairy tales after hearing this? She asked. Yes, it's truly a unique story, Crispo agreed. Crispo vividly imagined it all as if he were watching a movie. Antonio visited the rock bar every evening in the hope of meeting the waitress who had captivated him. Of course, he learned everything he could about Helia from mutual acquaintances. Eusebio, Sergio, and Bacho, all of them, of course, knew that Crispo had abandoned Helia right before the wedding and had fled to the capital. The guys didn't judge him, they understood their friend, especially since he had no intention of giving up on their child, and they even supported him, approving of his decision. Well, anyone can fall out of love, but dreams should come true, Bacho philosophically remarked when he found out that Crispo was leaving. Antonio saved Helia from despair, pulling her out of the depths of her despair. At first, Antonio came to her village every day, every single day, the charming young lady accompanying Crispo continued. But strangely enough, she didn't want to be with him. I can't imagine how that's possible. He's such a great person, and she must have really loved the guy who left her on the eve of her wedding. But Antonio kept visiting her, it's so romantic. Well, eventually, Helia melted, and they've been together ever since. Did they get married? Crispo asked. He had seen news about Antonio's wedding in the press, but there were no photos from the event on the internet. Besides, Antonio preferred not to publicize his personal life. Crispo couldn't have guessed that Antonio had married Helia, the same Helia he had run away from many years ago and, apparently, still had some feelings for her, or else where did this strange desire to humiliate her in front of everyone come from? Yes, they got married. By the way, the wedding took place here, but neither of them wanted any fuss around it. Everything went quietly and modestly, and then they flew to the capital and now live there. They came here for a few days to visit Antonio's parents. Eusebio found out and invited them to the wedding. Isn't it great? Helia arrived first. Antonio had some urgent business, but now he's here too. They make a wonderful couple, don't they? Crispo looked at Antonio and Helia. They were sitting at the other end of the table, surrounded by guests. Antonio was gently hugging his wife's shoulders, and she placed her hand on his knee. It was idyllic. They really looked harmonious together, and Crispo suddenly realized that he wanted to hug Helia, look into her eyes, and see her smile. He would never meet someone who would love him so sincerely again. Crispo had tried many times, but it was all in vain. He had destroyed his own happiness many years ago with his own hands, and now his reality was like this, toiling for pennies, living alone, with no friends or loved one by his side, and no children. The person who had once been his idol and whom Crispo still sincerely admired, Antonio, considered him a scoundrel, and quite rightly so, by the way. They have children, Crispo's companion, seemingly reading his thoughts, added, completing the picture of Helia's current happy life. She had no idea that Crispo was the very heartless groom who abandoned his bride just before the wedding, otherwise, she probably wouldn't have been so friendly with him. A boy and a girl's twins. I saw them even, they are as cute as babies in advertisements. Crispo felt like a nobody. At first, he wanted to impress his old acquaintances and show up here as a successful city guest who had achieved much more than his friends from his hometown. At least for these couple of days, he wanted to feel more significant than he actually was. And as for Helia, his desire to humiliate her seemed pathetic and ridiculous. Her life was so good that his attempts to spoil her mood looked, to put it mildly, foolish. Crispo couldn't stay here any longer. He felt suffocated by the atmosphere, and the sight of his happy-faced old acquaintances made him sick. The last thing he needed was to start behaving irrationally in front of everyone. Crispo was on the brink of smashing a plate on the floor, punching a wall, or even worse, bursting into tears. He was overwhelmed by a whirlwind of emotions. Crispo realized he needed to leave quietly and quickly, without saying goodbye to anyone. Antonio was here. After all, no one would notice Crispo's disappearance. He got up and headed for the exit. He needed to hurry. It was better to be far away from here, no matter where. This question was not of the utmost importance. And now Crispo was wandering through the city streets at night, crushed and bewildered. He felt like a complete nobody and regretted coming to Eusebio's wedding. It would have been better if this situation had never happened. Crispo, wait, I can't catch up with you, a pleading voice came from behind. Crispo turned around, and the young girl, Valeriana's cousin, whose name he hadn't even bothered to remember, was hurrying towards him. What are you doing here? He asked, surprised. You left so suddenly that I followed you. Your face looked strange and very sad, it seemed. Why on earth did you follow me? He wondered. Well, because I didn't want to part with you, she replied. Crispo looked into her clear, sincere eyes and was bewildered. Could he, such a despicable and vile person, actually appeal to this young beauty? Apparently, the girl was genuinely charmed by him. Strangely enough, this warmed his heart. Crispo realized that not everything was lost. He was only 35, with a whole life ahead of him. The kind of life he would have depended entirely on. Clearly, he had made plenty of mistakes, but he was only human. The main thing was to draw the right conclusions and move forward to live a happy life. He needed to change something about himself and his perception of the world. If his previous actions had led to such a disastrous outcome, it meant one thing: he had to act differently now, that was all. The girl looked at Crispo with hope, and in her eyes, he saw admiration. No, he had no intention of taking advantage of the young, beautiful, and naive lady. Right now, he was just going to escort her back to the restaurant. Who knew what could happen to a young girl on the streets at night? Before saying goodbye, Crispo would offer her some encouraging and wise words. After all, he was an adult. Then he would leave this city. He had a long journey ahead of him to work on his mistakes, but it would all work out. It would definitely work out.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.